can introduce Albany and I, just let them know that we're going to be answering questions. Yes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome.
Yep, the live stream has started.
Thank you. We're just gonna wait a few minutes before we launch in to let people log on. Okay, well, I'll just start by introducing myself. My name is Emma Hokoda, and I'm an Environmental Programs Associate for the City of Sunnyvale. And tonight you are attending Decarbonizing Transportation from Policy to Progress with Meghan Weir, who is a Principal Transportation Planner at Nelson Nygaard. And this event is part of the City of Sunnyvale Sustainability Speaker Series. Tonight with me, in addition to Meghan, we have my colleagues Madeline and Albany, who will be helping to answer questions as they come through, and on the back end of our Zoom. And then we have our Sustainability Commissioner, Doug Coons, who's here as well. So while we get rolling, we're just going to push through a couple of poll questions for all of you to see kind of where you're at before this talk and what you know about the city and about transportation and some of your preferences. So Madeline will push out our first poll for all of you. So we want to know, what percentage of greenhouse gas emissions in Sunnyvale comes from transportation? We want to see if you know the answer to this. So take some time to cast your vote. Right, we got about 65% of votes in. Okay, we're seeing a lot of 48%, a couple 28 and 67. All right, so 63% of you said 48%, and that is correct. So yes, transportation is actually the biggest emission sector out of the City of Sunnyvale's emissions pie. So it's really important for us to work on reducing this percentage because it is our largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions within the city. And so it's great that you're here to learn about this talk and learn about some ways that we can get that number down. So Madeline is now going to push out our next question, which is, what is Sunnyvale's greenhouse gas reduction target by 2030? So our target is to reduce our levels a certain percentage below our 1990 levels. And so how much below our 1990 levels are we trying to hit by 2030? And this is overall. Votes coming in. It's looking pretty tied up right now, pretty even. Take a couple more seconds to cast your vote. All right, so it looks like just barely by a couple percentage points and one additional person, we had 80% below 1990 levels. And that is the correct number for 2050. By 2030, we actually want to reduce by 56%. So you can see we have a couple different targets for 2019, 2030, and 2050. And this is part of our scoreboard, which we can drop the link for that, and you'll be able to see this in a lot more detail about our transportation sectors and all the different sectors and our goals and our progress on how we are to reaching these targets and reducing our emissions. All right, so now we have a couple transportation specific questions. So we want to know, how long are your typical daily trips? So this could be anything like a commute, going to the store, just when you think about your day, how long typically are those trips that you're taking? All right, I'm seeing a lot of 1 to 5 miles. Okay, so that is the majority. We have 62% of you. Most of your typical daily trips are between 1 to 5 miles. So that's really good to know. Megan will kind of touch on that later in her talk. So our next poll is, what is your favorite way to travel in Sunnyvale when you are not using a car? So we'd love to know how you get around when you're not driving. All right, a lot of walking and biking so far. Got a lot of bikers in this group, that's great. Oh, okay, walking is overtaking it. I feel like I'm sportscasting the poll. All right, take a couple more seconds to cast your vote. And it looks like walking has beat out biking. But biking is pretty close there. And we had one who likes to take the bus. So that's great to know. And we've got one final poll for you, which is, we want to know what kind of destinations you would like to travel to by walking or biking. So we know a lot of you like to walk and bike. Where would you like to go on those walks and bike rides? All right, there's a lot of action happening on this poll, but I'm seeing a majority for parks. Also, restaurants are pretty high up there. Groceries make sense. Take a couple more seconds. Okay, great. Well, parks won out for sure, but pretty much all of these, it sounds like, would be great if they were in walking or biking distance. That's great to know. And now, oh yes, one quick note about Zoom subtitle and transcript. So we have live transcripts that we're offering during this webinar. And so if you want to see the full transcript, you can select live transcript and then view full transcript. And then to hide the subtitles, you'll also click live transcript and then just hide the subtitles. So that's a note for anyone who would like to use that feature. It's in the bottom of your screen. And now I will introduce Doug Coons, who is our Sustainability Commission Vice Chair, and he will give a brief rundown of the event, explain what you're going to hear tonight, and then we'll pass it over to Megan for our talk.
Thank you, Emma. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for this virtual Sustainability Speaker Series event, Decarbonizing Transportation from Policy to Progress. Some quick background about the Sustainability Speaker Series. This series brings renowned experts in sustainability research and policy development to share their ideas and innovations with our community. The 2020 to 2021 theme is Playbook Strategies, in line with the City Council's 2019 adoption of Sunnyvale's Climate Action Playbook, as well as the City Council's priority of accelerating climate action. Some information about tonight's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to the city's website in following weeks. Attendees can type questions into the Q&A area at any point during the event, and those questions will be answered during the Q&A session during the last 30 minutes of the event. Questions will not be visible to the audience until they are answered. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Finally, we value your feedback. Please fill out an evaluation form on Google Forms after the event. The link will be posted in the chat. After the event, it will also be emailed to those who registered on Eventbrite. And now it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Meghan Weir is a principal transportation planner at Nelson Nygaard and is the Bay Area office leader. Meghan specializes in projects that make multimodal transportation work better for everyone. Her work supports active transportation and transit access and focuses on analysis, communication, consensus building, equity, and meaningful policy solutions. She lives in Berkeley and misses her daily bike commute to downtown Oakland. Please join me in welcoming Meghan Weir.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks, everyone, for setting this up. It's really great to be part of this speaker series. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with everyone tonight. And I am going to go through a presentation that, like Doug said, discusses decarbonizing transportation from policy to progress. And I'll just move right along here and tell you a little bit more about the structure of our conversation. But before I get into the presentation details, I wanted to just quickly share a tiny bit of background about Nelson Nygaard. So as Doug mentioned, I'm a principal transportation planner at Nelson Nygaard. I'm part of our Bay Area team. And Nelson Nygaard is a transportation planning consulting company, and we work with cities, counties, transit agencies, private employers, and all sorts of different clients to address mobility and transportation challenges all over the country, even in Canada. But most of my work is in the Bay Area. So let's see, clicking through here. There we go. To start with, I'm going to begin by discussing policy and how policy can support transportation goals, and also to provide some background about transportation analysis policy, especially focused on state level transportation policy. And then I'll switch and discuss more specific strategies for implementing that policy and what that can look like and how it changes the way our cities and streets function. So just no warm up here. I'm just gonna dive right in and get into some pretty, whoops, clicking through the slides a little bit too quickly here, but getting right into some details. So I want all of this to make sense, and I am I promise, mostly going to talk about things that really, that are part of our daily lives, but I also want everyone here to become your local neighborhood transportation analysis expert after hearing this talk. And so I'm going to start with some technical details to lay the groundwork, and then we'll talk about how that shapes decisions and development and what it feels like to walk to the grocery store or the park and so on. So just to make sure that we've all got the same vocabulary, I'm going to start by talking about measuring transportation function, and specifically a very standard approach of measuring transportation or doing transportation analysis is measuring level of service. So level of service is a measure of delay at intersections or along a road segment, and it's calculated based on the traffic capacity that a road provides and the traffic patterns on that road. So the traffic capacity that a road provides is a function of things like lane size, number of lanes, design speed, and the traffic patterns on that road is a function of volumes at different times across the day. And LOS is essentially measuring how long it takes for cars to move through intersections or across road segments. And LOSA represents the shortest amount of time and the least delay, and LOSF represents the longest amount of time for travel or the most delay. But what's really important here, and why I want you all to understand what LOS is before we start talking about some of the more productive ways of analyzing transportation, is that LOS, or level of service, does not represent anything related to greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, or what it feels like to walk or bike through a neighborhood. It is really just a measure of how things are flowing. It's kind of like treating our streets as a plumbing system, just like what is the capacity and what is the flow. And so just, whoops, sorry, I'm a little trigger happy here. There we, almost. There we go. That's the slide that I want to look at. So Also, an important thing to understand about LOS as an analysis tool is that the data inputs that we use to represent the traffic patterns, and then, of course, what we get is a measure of how the traffic flows within the geometry of the streets, but the inputs that represent the traffic patterns are based on typically the peak 15 minutes of the peak hour of every day. And so this chart is showing how traffic volumes might change. And this is pretty typical what you would see on any kind of like major road where people who commute and go to school and run errands are traveling, is that in the morning, traffic is highest and it drops down in the middle of the day and then bumps back up in the afternoon, but the afternoon volumes are spread out more. But when we do LOS analysis, or at least the way it's typically been applied over many years, is that it aims to capture the most extreme situation, which is the one time of day when it's most likely when the roads are most likely to be operating at or above capacity. And it doesn't capture the rest of the day when the roads might be much larger than necessary. Let's see if I can switch slides without jumping so much. There we go. So this is an example of what a street looks like when it's level of service A. What you can see is nothing's in the way. You can get, if you're driving a car, you can get from one end of the road to the other or through the next intersection without any delay. And here is a street that is an example of what it looks like when it's level of service F. And what you can see is that there is significant congestion. There's not a lot of space. There's cars up ahead down the road. However, this might look familiar to you because it's your neighbor, not far, University Avenue. It's an old picture, of course. We wouldn't be in such crowds this year, but from the perspective of how it feels to be out on the street and to walk around, and from an economic development perspective, this is actually performing quite well. It's only the traffic analysis at the peak volumes where this might be flagged as a problem, which brings me to the next slide, which shows, this one's a little bit animated. Here we go. Traffic engineer, what I just said is LOSF on University Avenue and LOSA on this big wide street. But there we go. Oops, sorry. I'm still getting used to the slide controls here. Economist would point out that this is actually functioning quite well when it's most congested, and that there's really not much economic activity or opportunity when the street is empty. The other thing that's problematic about using LOS as a measure of transportation function is that it takes the existing volumes into account, and when we're looking at what kind of impact a development might have on the transportation network, the new trips associated with that development are added to the existing trips, and so it biases in favor of places that have low volumes to begin with, whereas places like busy central areas in cities in the Bay Area, where there are already existing volumes on our streets, would be more likely to result in a poor performance according to the LOS standard. So want to just get that out of the way so that everybody is clear about some of the disadvantages of looking at our transportation network as if it's a plumbing system that's just meant to move cars through. And also introduce this more current measure of transportation performance or function, which is vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. And I'll be talking more about VMT and how we can move toward a low VMT cities and streets. And this is, again, I know there's, this is pretty technical and not something that we're going to focus on for the rest of the evening, but just want to make sure that everyone is kind of aware of the basics. And this slide has a lot of information. You don't need to digest all of it, but want to share the basic idea that vehicle miles traveled counts the number of vehicle miles for trips that are generated or attracted and to a project. And I'm phrasing this as if it's all about a project, because this is how this is applied for development review or for transportation infrastructure projects when considering environmental impacts of a project. And vehicle miles traveled reflects the transportation infrastructure, the transit service, and the existing land use. So it's an output from a transportation model, a regional or county transportation model that takes up a whole bunch of different factors into consideration. And it better captures the benefits of transit and active transportation trips. So whereas LOS is really just about the existing street geometry and the volumes that are meant to be accommodated on that street, vehicle miles traveled gives a picture of how the region functions as a whole, including the transportation infrastructure that might allow for people to travel without a car. And what we are interested in looking at in the world of analyzing transportation impacts for project review or for new developments, or just thinking about making investments in infrastructure around the region, is the vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, per capita or per worker. So thinking about in a residential setting, the VMT per capita, and in an office setting, the VMT per worker. And I'm happy to talk more about that if anybody wants to get into the details of VMT analysis during our Q&A, but the main takeaway is that this is a more comprehensive picture of what it's like, of what transportation looks like in the region. And so there has been a move at the state level to adopt VMT as the transportation analysis metric for environmental review. And that might be familiar to some of you who are involved in developments or development review, or follow CEQA review processes, California Environmental Quality Act review. But essentially, whenever there's a new project that's being proposed, the project sponsor has to provide a report about what the environmental impacts will be of that project. And transportation is one topic among many. And in the past, LOS was used to represent the transportation impacts, even though for all the reasons that I described, it really doesn't represent environmental impacts. And so now the state of California requires that VMT is the metric that represents environmental impacts. And this presents an opportunity to more closely tie the transportation analysis to a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the development of a multimodal transportation network, and a diversity of land uses. And those are the three key issues that have been called out by state policy. And to be specific, that state policy is SB 743, in case any of you are transportation policy wonks. And when we talk about vehicle miles traveled as an environmental, a metric to represent environmental impacts, that means that if there are impacts, VMT is what needs to be mitigated, as opposed to intersection operations needing to be mitigated, which if you address intersection operations directly, if there if an environmental review identifies poor intersection operations, the mitigation would be to expand the capacity of that intersection for vehicles, which is of course not going to lead to better outcomes for the environment for reducing greenhouse gases or investing in multimodal networks and so on. But if you identify the environmental impact in terms of VMT and development is found to contribute to high VMT, then VMT mitigation actually requires investments in multimodal networks, transportation demand management, changes to land use to support shorter and fewer trips by car, parking management, parking policies to rebalance the convenience of driving versus other modes. And in the long term, by mitigating and managing VMT, that leads more to what we often refer to as smart growth. So that leads me to the second part of this presentation, which is how can we support low VMT and this is, I'm realizing now this is slightly awkwardly phrased, but how can we grow while supporting low VMT or supporting low VMT development throughout the region? And I have been working on a project that is focused on planning for development in Moffett Park, right there in Sunnyvale. And so I have quite a few examples that relate to Moffett Park. And I've included them because it's top of mind for me because I've been working on this project recently, and also because they really illustrate concepts that apply everywhere in California. And we've just been, this timing is lucky that we've been putting together some materials for this project that are specific to Sunnyvale, but they really do apply everywhere in California and in other parts of Sunnyvale. And so you'll see some perhaps familiar locations and a lot of centering around Moffett Park, but all of this is still relevant to the rest of the city. So to begin with, the whole Bay Area is growing, which is, of course, essential to address our housing crisis and growing economy, and is nothing new for the Bay Area or California. We've been growing for a long time. And this map shows some current or near-term development plans in Sunnyvale and neighboring cities. And so just kind of a snapshot of the reality that there is quite a bit of development happening. And of course, that means that our transportation network will have to accommodate that additional development and the various trips and coming and going that people who live and work in these new developments will require. And at the same time, there is traffic congestion already, and anyone who lives here knows that and is familiar with it and has been, driving slower than the speed limit on a highway at some point. And we know from looking at data in the region, the traffic congestion is outpacing economic growth and transit investments. In other words, the number of minutes that people driving on Bay Area roadways spend driving lower than 35 miles per hour on highways is increasing at a rate faster than our economic growth and faster than our transit investments. So it's not just a one-for-one that every time we generate more economic development that we inevitably have more traffic congestion. It's actually perhaps an indication that we need to do some catching up with transit investments in order to rebalance. And thinking about Moffett Park specifically and Sunnyvale specifically as an example, there is certainly constrained access to freeways to get to and from the regional highway network, and travel time on US 101 is notoriously unpredictable. So what can we do about that? Well, we've got some great advantages to begin with. And this slide is titled Moffett Park is centrally located and well connected, but the same goes for Sunnyvale as a whole. For example, Caltrain stops in Sunnyvale and a number of nearby cities, and people traveling to and from Sunnyvale can use a variety of different train stops in Sunnyvale or the Mountain View Caltrain stop for more frequent service. There is also private bus connections that bring employees to and from some of the major office developments in Sunnyvale and nearby cities to transit stations. BART is not far and is getting closer. Downtown San Jose is not far. And so there are a number of options for getting around the region. And if we zoom in, the size of this is referring to the district, which is part of the planning area for this Moffett Park project, but just in general, the size of Moffett Park and the size of Sunnyvale as a whole is walkable and bikeable. When you look at what a 15-minute walk radius looks like and what a 15-minute bike radius looks like, it really does encompass a pretty significant chunk of the city of Sunnyvale. And that is even more true in other parts of Sunnyvale where there's already quite a bit of mixed use downtown or residential streets that have a smaller street grid. And we'll talk a little bit about how the design of streets makes a difference. And so there really are there's a good baseline for having a place that you can get around without relying on a car. And more examples from Moffett Park, but to Sunnyvale as a whole, there is an existing path and trail network that's a great starting point. However, a lot of the streets are not designed for walking and biking. And these are images from Moffett Park, but we see streets like this all over the Bay Area, especially in neighborhoods that are dominated by single land uses. So especially in neighborhoods with office parks or other kind of like destinations that are all one land use, and where streets are designed for cars rather than people. So the sidewalks are narrow, or they require people to kind of be funneled into inconvenient crossing locations. The bike lanes just end. And so we've got what we know is a pretty walking distance or biking distance friendly city, and a great trail network, and wonderful neighborhoods, and parks and downtown restaurants and so on, but not quite the right infrastructure to make it easy to navigate all of those spaces. And then on top of that, adding to the car-dominated landscape from having wide streets with narrow sidewalks, much of the property frontage, even where there are sidewalks, is taken up by surface parking. And again, this is focused on Moffett Park, and because that is currently mostly office developments, I know that this is not representative of the whole city of Sunnyvale, but there are neighborhoods like this all over the Bay Area, and it's not atypical. And in this particular plan area, you can see on this little chart that 33% of the land is dedicated to what is essentially low cost or often free vehicle storage, rather than engaging destinations or green space or storefronts or schools or rec centers or some of the other places that you all noted are places that you would like to walk or bike. And so it's not only underutilized in terms of just like the potential value that it brings as land use, it also contributes to a walking or biking environment where everyone feels a little isolated on one side, you've got big, wide roads that are designed for cars, and on the other side, you've got big parking lots full of cars, and the connection to the surrounding buildings and landscape and other people that you might encounter is pretty separated. Another thing that can get in the way, or that reinforces the need to drive for most trips, is that the existing blocks are quite big, are quite long, and make pedestrian trips less convenient. So want to make note that Moffett Park block lengths are much longer than those in Sunnyvale's historical core. And there are a couple pictures here that show, just for a sense of scale or familiarity, a long block and example along El Camino Real versus a short block closer to downtown on Washington Avenue. But looking at the lengths here and just recognizing that this is not only true in Moffett Park, but in many parts of the Bay Area and elsewhere, we're talking about block lengths that are in the range of a quarter mile to a half a mile long. And so if you're thinking about how far you're willing to walk, and the blocks are that long to begin with, it really does feel like a slog just to get from one corner to the next. And not only does it feel like a slog, there we go. It also just makes walking inconvenient. And to put some real specifics to what the impacts of inconvenience can have, there's a diagram here. This diagram shows how much longer it can take to walk somewhere if there isn't a convenient connection, whether that's a crosswalk or a shorter block in the first place, versus if you can just make the shortest, make your trip following the shortest possible line. So if somebody gets off a bus and there isn't a crosswalk nearby and the destination is across the street and they have to walk a very long block length and then cross the street and backtrack, that could take 5 minutes just from getting off the bus to going into the door of their destination that's right across the street. Whereas if the block length is shorter, or there is a crosswalk, or just generally the street is designed at a pedestrian scale, that could be a 30-second walk. So getting back to the earlier question, this isn't meant to be gloomy, but want to understand what are some of the things that are just built into our local landscapes that have a real effect on how often and how far we drive our cars to get around, and what contributes to the vehicle miles traveled in our neighborhoods, in our cities, in our region. All of these things add up. And one more slide that shows another example of how this can make a difference. There we go. There is transit service, but it often doesn't meet the future land use needs, and the connections aren't necessarily walkable. And there is a lot of great transit service too. As I said earlier, there are connections. It is possible to get across the region in many directions right from Sunnyvale, but want to make note that that doesn't necessarily feel like a solution unless it's designed in a way and it's frequent enough to be convenient. So what is happening to solve for this, these challenges and support lower VMT cities and streets? There are quite a few city policy and planning efforts that are local. These are all examples of policy and planning efforts local to Sunnyvale. There is an active transportation plan that's hot off the presses, brand new. And there's a real focus in that active transportation plan to build all ages and abilities networks for biking and walking. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides, but essentially, a network that that feels inviting and safe to people, even if they're not self-proclaimed road warriors. there are a number of plans for infrastructure. The Mary Avenue overcrossing is just one example. There are quite a few others that can help relieve some of the north and south connections, or provides more north-south connections, and improve multimodal access across barriers. So in the case of the Moffett Park project, because that's so close to really big arterials and grade separated arterials, that's an important one. The general plan and land use and transportation element in Sunnyvale calls for less dependency on cars and better and transit oriented placemaking. So just building this into policies so that more investments can be tied to the local plans and policies, makes it easier to justify those investments, or to hold those priorities high when decisions are being made about different investments. The list goes on: the Complete Streets policy, the Climate Action Plan. It's great to realize at the beginning of this, as Doug was introducing me, that this series is part of the Climate Action Plan playbook, and that specifically calls for reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the city in many different ways. And Vision Zero policies call for specific infrastructure changes, and so on. So there's a lot that's already happening that supports a change to lower VMT design. When we focus on specific case studies, we can see the impacts of targeted trip reduction efforts. So also want to call out that there's actually some really great data about how what VMT looks like, or what the drive alone rate is for commutes into Sunnyvale, and specifically looking at the Moffett Park Business Group, which includes, of course, some pretty major employers, but a number of smaller employers that share that that office space. And looking over time as a targeted trip reduction efforts, and what we often refer to as transportation demand management programs, have been put into place by employers. There's a number of different incentives and options and shuttles that are provided to make it easier for people to get to work without driving alone. And that drive alone rate has really dropped significantly over time. And compared to the Santa Clara County drive alone rate across the entire county, it's an average of 75% drive alone for commutes, whereas in the Moffett Park Business Group, the drive alone rate is only about 58%, and it's even lower among some specific employers within Moffett Park that have made significant investments in providing shuttles and so on. So this really does, there is a lot of room for making changes simply on the program and incentive side for putting these policies into place. And then what I want to talk about for the rest of this presentation is how we can integrate a variety of different strategies, and why those strategies make a difference. And that this is really all taken all together, these can really add up to decarbonizing transportation, or just generally making, giving people more choices, so that when folks travel by car, it's not because it's the only way they can get around. There's actually quite a few other ways to connect to the rest of the city and the region. And so the next set of slides, I'm going to go through what I mean by each of these, but basically these kind of core strategies: prioritize people over vehicles. That doesn't mean get rid of vehicles, but just understanding vehicles are for moving people. There are other ways for people to move as well. Convenient and connected transit system, comfortable pedestrian and bike networks, mobility hubs, land use to support a multimodal neighborhood, transportation demand management programs, and right sizing parking. So when we talk about prioritizing people over vehicle movement, it's really important to note that prioritizing walking, biking, and high capacity options moves more people in less space, and supports community growth without exacerbating traffic. So if we design cities and streets in ways that make it really hard to get where you need to go without a personal vehicle, then a lot of space needs to be dedicated to those personal vehicles. But if we have systems in place that make it easy to get around by other modes, there's still room for personal vehicles. And there's also room for much more compact modes of travel, including taking transit, biking, carpooling, and walking. And these are all options that can also contribute to having more activity on the streets and just generally creating spaces where there's a lot of people out and about, and the streets become more inviting in some of the ways that we talked about earlier, And convenient and connected transit systems are also really key. And most of us have had the experience of, being interested in taking transit and then realizing that it's going to take longer than driving. So I do want to emphasize that we're talking about convenient and connected transit systems because that is what's necessary for those systems to really function and serve a variety of needs for getting around. And just thinking about the basic geometry premise and what was illustrated in the previous slide, you can move more people in less space when there's priority infrastructure for high capacity mobility and active transportation modes. That's a lot of pretty technical industry words, but what I mean is what you can see on the left side, where most of the vehicles are kind of gold and orange, is that there are a few buses, but they're mixed in with other cars. And that means that they go at the same speed as other cars. And if cars are slow, the buses are slow. And on the right side, where most of the vehicles are more kind of green and blue, there is dedicated space so that those buses have priority, and it can actually be an advantage to be a passenger on a bus because you don't have to wait behind cars. So thinking about this is obviously a really simple kind of cartoony way of illustrating that, but thinking about what it takes to make investments to support those convenient transit options. And what can that do for enhancing local transit connections? Thinking specifically about Sunnyvale, by supporting connections to the existing transit system, it can be a lot easier to get across town. And there are quite a few destinations. Again, this is taken from some of the materials that we have been working with for the Moffett Park project, but really emphasizing the opportunities to move across town efficiently without a car. And if the transit is available, then you can move quite a few more people in the same amount of space. So we don't have to radically change our streets or build a monorail or, totally adjust the way the streets function, but just changing the priority on those streets and also addressing the lack of connection or building in connections where they're missing right now, where there are gaps. And the same thing applies at the regional level. And if local transit connections can work for riders by getting people across town to various train stations and busy hubs, then that makes it easy to connect to a regional system and travel far beyond Sunnyvale. So as I had pointed out earlier, within a 5-mile radius, you can connect to several Caltrain stations. So take your pick of various frequencies and schedules, and Caltrain investments are being made in electrification to make those schedules even more convenient. And within a 10-mile radius, you can connect to BART, and that's continuing to get closer. So you really can make a difference with convenient and connected transit systems. And the next strategy is comfortable pedestrian and bicycle networks. And the emphasis here is to create prioritized spaces and networks for people who walk and bike, and thinking really about comfortable facilities and what it takes for people to feel invited to walk and bike, and not like they have to sacrifice something or they have to be very brave to walk and bike. So it's really important to call this out, because there are quite a few streets all over the region that technically have bike lanes or have a striped shoulder or have a sharrow or an arrow with a bicycle painted on right in the middle of a driving lane. And those are often identified as part of a network, but that kind of network doesn't encourage people to try something new and to bike if they're not already comfortable biking, or to bike with kids or older folks. And so it's really important when we're thinking about creating spaces and networks that work for pedestrians and people who bike, that those are networks that connect from home to destinations using facilities that really do feel safe and inviting for a wide range of ages and abilities. And then I have a few more examples. Oops, again, getting a little trigger happy here. Let's see if I can click back there. Too far. Okay, thanks everyone for your patience. A few more examples of what is meant by, well, in this one more example of something to consider for comfortable and pedestrian bicycle networks. I talked about block size earlier and how very long block sizes can be alienating and inconvenient and just make trips take a lot longer if you're not driving in a car and you can't just pull up into a parking lot. And just for contrast, this is an image of Moffett Park block on the left, and the same size showing 14 blocks in Mission Bay, which is a relatively new San Francisco development, where there used to be, similar to Moffett Park, a lot of single land use development and large parking lots, and you can still see that there are a lot of parking lots in this San Francisco image, but the blocks that are being developed are being built at more of a pedestrian scale, and this is the kind of scale that you see in older residential neighborhoods and downtown streets as well, typically. So creating street networks when we have opportunities to build and redevelop that provide those paths and connections that make it easy and convenient and give people more options. The next strategy is connect people, place, and services at mobility hubs. And mobility hubs is a little bit of a buzzword these days, but it's definitely a good description of something that we definitely recommend and encourage, because there are so many advantages to co-locating mixed land uses and transit and consolidated parking. And so this is an example, again, in Moffett Park, but you can imagine this being relevant anywhere where there's transit, but identifying some of the key transit hubs and then recognizing that it's a priority for people to access that transit, and those people should be coming from a variety of different land uses. So they're coming and going, not just all arriving at the same time and all leaving at the same time, but a mix of shops and housing and offices and rec centers and so on. And then when they're all coming and going at these important transit hubs, there's an opportunity to co-locate other conveniences and make the transit connections as legible and simple and easy to navigate as possible. So trying to focus more on opportunities to say you can figure out how to pay for parking and stay parked here for the rest of the day and make the rest of your trips by foot or by bike share or using a scooter or hopping on transit. And all of that is pretty easy to figure out because the information is right here and there's plenty of places to come and go to at the same time. And you might have noticed a theme that I'm not just talking about transportation infrastructure or policy or analysis the whole time. I keep talking about where people are coming and going to and from and the mix of land uses. And it is really important to consider land use to support a multimodal neighborhood. So you don't just get multimodal neighborhoods because a bunch of people are willing it to be true or are so committed to taking scooters everywhere or riding the bike that it doesn't even matter if their local needs are met. You really need to support multimodal neighborhoods with mixed use environments. And that helps to contribute to reducing VMT because people have the option to make fewer and shorter trips by car. A lot of times we talk about 20-minute neighborhoods. That's also a little bit of a catchphrase these days, but the idea is that you can have most of your daily needs met within a 20-minute walking distance. And it's really important to consider how all of these different strategies fit together and to think about just what the reality is, how people are going to need to move around. You can't, build an office and assume that everyone is going to make a short trip because employment is inherently regional. And if you have residential, the people who live in those buildings are going to need access to stores and parks and rec centers and schools and daycares and so on. And these two images are meant to illustrate just how vastly different the activity levels can be and how you can justify more investments in multimodal networks and resources and various systems like bike share and shuttles and light rail and a really inviting pedestrian landscape and so on when there's more activity. So these are the kind of things that feed on each other. The more mixed use there is, the more activity there is, the more transit riders you have, the easier it is to get developers to build mixed use development and so on. And another illustration here of how important multimodal neighborhoods are and thinking about the impacts of housing on mobility. And housing has really been an emphasis in conversations around Moffett Park because that area does not currently include housing. But really, you can say housing or just mixed use or, pick whatever's missing from any neighborhood. In some neighborhoods, it's all housing and what's missing is retail and commercial activity and schools and so on. But these, again, are two contrasting images. One, in a single use environment, requires long trips to work and services and really results in a lot of single direction travel. So everyone wakes up in the same place and has to move out of the neighborhood to have their daily needs met and then comes back into the neighborhood at relatively the same time. And that means that a lot of the streets are empty most of the time, except for when they're very busy in the morning and evening. And generally, this type of land development pattern encourages driving. And if neighborhoods are developed or retrofitted with more mixed uses, it facilitates shorter trips. It means that people don't have as far to travel to get where they need to go. They can travel. They have more options when they have to make those trips, and there's more multi-directional travel, so everyone isn't always moving in the same direction, and that also supports investments, increased investments in transit. And then another, almost at the end of my list of strategies here, transportation demand management programs, and this is what I mentioned when I showed the slide illustrating the the mode share and the decrease in drive alone trips to Moffett Park a little bit earlier. A lot of that is tied to the transportation demand management programs that are in place that are largely sponsored by employers and in Moffett Park, but are often can be sponsored and supported by employers, but also, public agencies and residential developments and schools. There's all sorts of examples of different entities that can implement and maintain and administer transportation demand management programs. And these programs generally include a variety of strategies that fall into these categories: subsidizing non-auto travel options, understanding that for people who already own a car and have that resource built in, that choosing other options feels like an additional cost. So there's if those costs can be subsidized, it kind of evens the playing field. Providing new transportation options, like just bringing in electric bikes or having car share available, and incentivizing alternative travel behavior, making it easier for people to carpool, sometimes paying employees to carpool, recognizing that employers have often invested, sort of by default or by accident, have invested a great deal of money in vehicle storage with all of the parking lots around them, and can recognize that there's an opportunity. Instead of just making that available for free, they could incentivize people trying other modes by kind of shifting that equation and making not driving more financially appealing than driving. And speaking of making not driving more financially appealing than driving, the final strategy on my list here today is right-size parking for the district. And again, the term district pops up because a lot of this material was developed fairly recently for Moffett Park project, but this is true for any district. So it could be right-size parking for any district. It could be a downtown commercial district, or a new development area, or a city as a whole. And again, these kind of two options, one on the left, which is really typical, which is distributed parking, meaning there's parking distributed at each of the land uses. So each individual destination has and maintains its own parking. And that means that those destinations are pretty spread out because they're separated by what I often think of as big moats of parking lots wrapped around those buildings. And it means that if you're walking along the sidewalk, you might have to walk through a bunch of parking aisles just to get to the front door, versus shared district parking, where parking can be consolidated, and then you have a whole lot of opportunity to fill in the gaps from that are no longer need to be dedicated to parking spaces, and have a livelier space and more destinations. And then within those, within that developed area, because there are more destinations, it's easier to walk and to get everything that you need without going back and forth to a car and changing to a different parking lot every time. And that brings me to this last slide, just to revisit what all these strategies are: prioritize people over vehicles, convenient transit system, pedestrian and bike networks, mobility hubs, multimodal supportive land use, TDM programs, and right-size parking. And what I really want to emphasize, and what comes up in a lot of the work that I do in transportation planning and thinking about how transportation analysis and policies and development decisions all fit together, is that we really can't choose from an a la carte menu for these strategies. It's important to use them together. That doesn't mean everything all at once, but understanding that each of these strategies needs to be phased in some way to achieve the intended outcomes, which is lower greenhouse gas emissions, more mixed use development, more choices, more more choices to get around without a car, and easier to make shorter and fewer trips by car. So you can't have transit without good access and land use that brings a lot of people to those transit hubs. You can't have great walking environments if there's too much parking. You can't get people out of their cars if it's cheaper and more convenient to just drive and park. And that's, none of these are, problems with individual characters. It's just the reality that there's a lot of forces at play. And so we need to build our cities and streets to really take advantage of what all those forces are, and generally move toward environments where it's easier to get around without a car. And I'll just wrap this up by saying that kind of goes back to the poll questions that Emma asked earlier, when she asked, how long are your trips? How long are your typical daily trips? And most folks answered between 1 and 5 miles. You can really get pretty far between 1 and 5 miles, even if you don't have a car, if you have convenient and connected networks that give people a lot of flexibility. So you don't have to make every 1 mile trip without a car, but if you live in a place in a city where development and transportation infrastructure takes all of these things into consideration, then it can be easier to ask yourself, do I really need a car? Or is this a trip that might be even more convenient, even more pleasant and inviting by walking or biking or catching a shuttle and so on. And that is it for my presentation. And I think we're pretty on time for questions and answers. So I'll pass it back over.
Great, thank you, Megan. Sorry, my mouse was having some difficulties there.
I know how that goes.
But here I am. That was wonderful. So thank you so much for that presentation. Just to remind everyone, in case you need to drop off now, to fill out our feedback survey. And for those of you sticking around for the Q&A, just remind you to direct all of those questions to our Q&A box, and we'll sort through them and I'll read them to Megan. We'll answer them one at a time. And then if anyone does want to ask a question verbally, you can use the raise hand function now. And so we can call on you. That way will work as well. And if you do so, we ask that you please try to limit your question to 30 seconds per question, just so that we can get everyone's questions in. And we will let you know when your time is up for that. So I will jump into some of the questions that we've already received. And I see you've got a couple hands raised, so we'll start working through these, and feel free to keep asking questions as I go. Okay, so we have one question that asks, how does COVID impact the Moffett Park use plan specifically, and any of your other projects that you might be working on, Megan?
That is a frequent question these days, and there are a lot of different ways to answer it. The Moffett Park plan specifically is not, the main COVID impact is that all of our project team meetings are remote. And so we're doing a lot of Zoom calls, but it's a longer range plan. There's no real change to the long-term goals for how Moffett Park might be developed and what kind of destinations might be prioritized there. And we're moving forward with that plan and policy work around that plan, on the assumption that people will be back to more typical activity levels soon. I will say there is an assumption, I think, just in general, all over among employers, not just transportation planners, that commute patterns will probably change and folks might not be commuting to an office 5 days a week, but there are already many people who do commute, and lots of essential workers that need to get around, and a commitment to creating office environments that work for people safely, even post-COVID.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got another question from Michael. Michael asks, how would you address an elephant in the room, which is too low frequency on buses on most routes? This is the main obstacle to people who'd like to use public transit. Yeah,
this is a great question. And this is definitely a question that comes up a lot in the Moffett Park project and many other projects, because policies and goals and priorities and even development decisions don't automatically change transit service. But this is where we have to keep the long game in mind. And right now, one of the reasons that transit service is low frequency is because many of the riders are folks that don't have other choices. And so there isn't a significant demand in terms of volume to justify higher frequency on many transit routes outside of San Francisco. That is not true of San Francisco, and was not true, at least before COVID, of BART. There are transit systems in the Bay Area. Caltrain is one of them as well, that were pretty maxed out. And those agencies have been pushing for higher frequency and for the infrastructure that allows higher frequency. But in places where the land use doesn't bring a lot of activity, it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. And so my recommendation is that that's why I would come back to the multi-strategy approach, that we can't wait for transit frequency to suddenly make transit use more convenient. We have to do a lot of things to address what the gaps are now, and then over time, those investments can create an environment that supports higher frequency transit. So it's a bit of a long-term approach, but there are plenty of ways to fill in the gaps. Employers are running shuttles. There's a lot of new, what we call micro transit, like electric scooters and bikes, and flexible modes like point-to-point car share, as opposed to renting a car from one place and returning it to the same place. So there are a lot of ways to build in more flexibility, while we also create an environment that supports more frequent transit.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for answering that. Yeah, it's definitely, there's a lot of factors there. Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming in. So there's one from John. He asks, how does Sunnyvale implement these changes when the city does not control the transit system, for example?
Yeah, great question, and very much related to what I was just saying. Sunnyvale can implement a number of changes. Sunnyvale can, and is already, and I do want to emphasize that, so many of the policies and the existing infrastructure plans and projects that are in the works right now are supporting that, by designing streets that are flexible and can be adapted to prioritize transit in the future, even if the transit isn't demanding that dedicated space right now, and by building out connected networks for biking and walking, and those networks can also serve electric scooters and yet to be popularized modes. We don't know what's coming next, but there's a lot of what I often think of as human scale transportation, like modes that work for one or two people at a time. And then the mix of land use is really important, and just recognizing that the more we prioritize development in places where it's easy to walk and bike, the easier it is to walk and bike, and the more people that you have who are getting around without a car, the more the bigger the transit customer base is. And again, it kind of feeds on itself.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of collaboration there that's happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So we have another question asking, so how could someone make a grocery run that's about a mile away without a car when they're carrying groceries? That kind of classic issue where if you don't have a car, how do you carry your items?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is important to think about these just day-to-day practicalities. So I guess I think important to have a two-part answer. One is that if we can design and build and develop cities in a way that makes it easy for people to get their day-to-day needs met without driving, then getting in a car to really load up on heavy groceries every 1 to 2 weeks is not the main challenge when it comes to reducing VMT and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that it's worth recognizing that that's the type of trip that might sometimes be appropriate for some people, depending on what their particular grocery and vehicle options are. That said, there are, I think, a couple key solutions that are not hard to implement. One is more neighborhood grocery stores that make those trips shorter. And not that 1 mile is a very long trip, but for some people, a trip to the grocery store is much more than 1 mile. And just recognizing that's an example of a change in land use, and having more corner stores for some of those shorter trips, so that or smaller trips, so then the big grocery trips can be spread out more. And the other is that there are a lot of really great options for carrying cargo without a car. And there are some pretty fancy cargo bikes that I have friends that really love their cargo bikes and love loading up and carrying kids and groceries and all sorts of things. But even without those, I have a rack on my bike that is pretty sturdy, and I also use it to make grocery trips and really load up on heavy things. And I don't have to carry it in my arms or in a backpack because I can just put it on my rack. And I always am surprised when I take it off my rack and I have to carry it from my bike through my front door. And it's actually pretty clumsy and difficult to carry because it's like fitting many grocery bags in one. But while I'm on my wheels, it's really easy. So I would recommend, like, visit your local bike shop. The people who work there are super into bikes and accessories and have thought about these questions before. Local bicycle coalitions have classes. Some of them are running classes now that are more about like how to get around during COVID, and like if people aren't commuting as much or biking to school, what are their needs? And they're getting questions like, how do I bring takeout home on a bike? So there's lots of resources out there if that's something that you're interested in doing. It's pretty fun to really load up and get home and be like, yep, I just got everything I needed and I didn't have to use a car.
Yeah, that's great. I also have a bike with a bike rack on it, and I've gone grocery shopping before, and it's great when it's convenient to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so there's another question asking, is there any data on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by going to more efficient land use?
Yes, there is. And so I guess I should start. I assume when you say more efficient land use, that what is meant is more variety of land uses, more mix of land use, a higher density, as opposed to the inefficiency of having single land uses that are very spread out and separated by parking lots or undeveloped areas. So I'm just going to move forward with that as a definition of more efficient land use. And I hope that matches up with what you're asking. Yes, absolutely. There is a lot of data and modeling and checking travel models against data that shows that there are people make fewer and shorter trips when the land use supports it. And people make longer and more frequent trips when that's what they have to do to have their daily needs met. So yeah, absolutely. That's when we look at maps of the region that show vehicle miles traveled per census block, for example, or other kind of like analysis zones. Sometimes we refer to transportation analysis zones instead of census blocks in transportation modeling, because we don't only use census data. But when we look at maps of the region, what you can see is that the low VMT locations are the locations that have transit and are often like the older, denser neighborhoods that were developed when cities in the Bay Area were less built for cars, and the outer edges of those cities and the newer developed, more recently developed neighborhoods, or the single land use, like kind of older, separated industrial neighborhoods or office park neighborhoods, or residential subdivision neighborhoods are the ones that have the highest vehicle miles traveled per capita.
Great. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left, and there's a couple more questions we want to get through. I see we have one hand raised, so I'm going to let you talk to ask your question in 30 seconds or less.
Great. I'm just unmuting. Thank you. And thank you so much, Megan, for a great presentation. This is Jane, and I just love so many of your ideas. And I just wanted to offer, I invented a part of my counseling practice. It's called active transportation counseling. And I try to help people overcome barriers that they have to using active transportation. And one thing I find is that if we keep it small, like a small step outside their comfort zone, so they're not aiming for perfection, that might mean that they'll even drive to a train station or something, a bus station at first, while trying to put in maybe once or twice a month one of these ways to do it, and then they get much more comfortable with it. So have you thought about pulling in some of the behavioral science to help some of this happen?
Yeah, I think that's a really wonderful point, and I appreciate you framing it that way. And that definitely is the underlying one of the underlying reasons that that I'm talking about fewer and shorter trips by car as opposed to just eliminating trips by car. And when I talk about mobility hubs or right-sizing parking for the district, want to recognize the importance of including parking and making it possible for people to get around by cars. There may be some people that take a lot of small steps and eventually they decide, hey, this is actually more fun, and I'm going to stop traveling by car for almost all my trips, or I don't need to own my own car anymore. But there are always going to be some people that need to take all of their trips by car, and we recognize that. We have a really diverse region. It's one of our strengths. It's part of what makes this a great place to live, is that and what makes cities, I think in particular, as a fan of cities, just personally, I think it's part of what makes cities great places to live, is that there are all sorts of different people coming and going in different directions and with different needs. But it is important that we find ways to accommodate the variety of needs and to recognize that not every trip can be not every car trip can be replaced by another mode, but there are ways to make those car trips shorter. And then the other thing that what was I going to add to that? Oh, the emphasis on comfortable and convenient networks is really important. There's no way that someone who was feeling cautious about riding a bike yesterday is going to decide, I heard a talk and I'm just going to start riding a bike instead. If they don't look out and see that there's a place that looks inviting and comfortable and where they would feel safe, like having a kid in a bike seat behind them, or, you know, just generally being open to it. But when these policies and incentives and development priorities and networks are built out and put into place, it does change behavior. And a lot of places that are famous for being so inviting for biking and walking and taking transit around the world weren't always that way. So there are a lot of cities that are full of people biking now, and you know, as recently as a decade or 2 decades ago, they weren't. Amsterdam is one really famous example. The bike networks that exist today in Amsterdam were the result of some pretty specific transportation policies and priorities and like liability decisions around, you know, expectations for driver responsibility and in crashes, for example, and advocates who used to stand at busy intersections and hold signs that say, like, I don't know Dutch well enough to get it right, but basically there were big signs advocating for the end of killing children, and they used those really blunt terms because of traffic deaths. So I'm going off into a tangent, but my point is that these things are certainly incremental. They're incremental for individuals and they're incremental for cities and regions. And we do see the impact that has at a scale over time.
Yeah, and that's great to hear of examples of places doing that more recently. So that's awesome. Okay, let's try to get through a couple more questions in our last 5 minutes. So we've got a question asking about the dedicated bus lanes that you brought up, and they've been advanced before and met significant resistance. Do you have any thoughts on how we could overcome resistance against dedicated bus lanes?
Yeah, well, and I guess I should preface this by saying among the people that I work with, I do not specialize in transit planning, but of course, transit planning is part of transportation networks. So there are folks that could get much more in depth about dedicated bus lanes and what it takes for them to be successful. But I think at a high level, the key is for those streets to operate effectively in both the short term and the long term. And there have been places where dedicated bus lanes were put into place as a pilot project, or just wasn't maybe necessarily meant to be short term, but ended up being short term because the use of buses wasn't frequent enough to like visually indicate that it was important. So there are people that were always looking and seeing what looked like empty bus lanes. And the other lanes were not necessarily operating in a way that was convenient for other users. So this gets back to the like ring of puzzle pieces in my last slide, that these strategies really need to be implemented together. It's important to identify what it takes for a street to operate effectively for you know, a significant number of users in the short term, and then consider ways to phase in changes. And I also think that it's important to like come up with a long range vision and a plan, and figure out what phasing is necessary to make that a reality, and for there to be some political will to commit to that, because there's always going to be somebody that's sort of, you know, stuck at an intersection, not moving as fast as they would like to in a single occupancy vehicle, and thinking that it isn't fair that there's all of this empty lane next to them that they should be moving through. But the reality is that buses carry quite a few more people, and when we measure just based on vehicle delay, we're not actually measuring the impacts that it has on people. And bus riders have been historically undercounted in transportation analysis for a really long time. So it's a complicated answer, but I think it takes a multi-layered approach and a combination of having lots of options so that our streets aren't so crowded by vehicles, and also some commitment over time to phasing that in until it really does make a difference.
Great. Well, I think we are just out of time, but thank you for everyone for submitting your questions, and thank you to Megan for that Q&A session, getting through as many as we could. I will pass it back to Doug to wrap up. Oh, I guess that was our last slide.
Thank you very much, Emma. So just want to remind everyone to please fill out your evaluation for this event. The link is in the chat and will be emailed to attendees who registered over Eventbrite. Next up, the recording will be emailed in the days that are following this event. Finally, we want to let you know that we have one more speaker series event scheduled in the cycle. It's called Talk and Trash with Karen Gisibel and Mark Bowers, and it will be on May 19th. From 7 to 8:30 p.m. We want to very much extend our thanks to Meghan Weir for this informative and interesting talk, and thank the audience for their time and their participation and their questions. Thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.